You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Campus podcast with me, Miranda Prynne, editor of Campus. This week we are talking about policy impact and how academics can best engage with policymakers to help inform decisions. At its best, this results in policy making based on solid evidence and thus better outcomes for society as a whole. And for academics, this could be considered the gold standard of impact. But academics, politicians and civil servants will tell you there are plenty of instances where the relationship between researchers and government breaks down or simply fails to flourish. And even more instances of researchers being unable to generate any interest in their work at all from policymakers. So we are going to hear why this kind of work is so worthwhile, what works to capture the attention of those in government, and what are some common challenges from two academics steeped in policy work from either side of the Atlantic. Michael Sanders is a Professor of Public Policy at King's College London and Director of the School for Government. In addition to his academic career, he has worked in government as Chief Scientist on the Behavioural Insights Team and was the founding Chief Executive of What Works for Children's Social Care. David Garcia is a professor with Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and the director of the Arizona Education Policy Initiative at Arizona State University. Prior to joining ASU, he helped found the Arizona Center for Public Policy, ThinkAZ. He has worked as associate superintendent and a director of research and policy at the Arizona Department of Education. He is also a former legislative staffer with the Arizona State Senate and was the 2018 Democratic candidate for governor of Arizona. So both these men have direct experience of working in government. Now, the little I know from simply working as a journalist is that governments are fiendishly complicated things, and each one functions in its own unique way. So the US government, with its federal system, and state governments, which hold a lot of important decision-making powers, is a very different beast to the UK, which, being a much smaller country, possibly unsurprisingly has a much more centralised system, with Westminster retaining control of most of the key policy areas. And this makes it important to seek advice from those familiar with your policy context. But there are some universal lessons, as you will hear, in terms of effective communication, understanding your intended audience, building relationships, and more. Now, first we will hear from David Garcia, who really puts people at the heart of policy work.
Hi, David, and welcome to the Campus podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
You've taught graduate students about how to engage in policy, and I would like to know, what is the first thing that you tell them?
The very first thing I tell them is to get started, to get out and engage. And let me tell you how I define and how I think about engagement. I'm not talking about one-directional armchair engagement where we send something out without any way of understanding how it's impacting the world. You see that a lot, for example, people who blog. I'm sorry, even a podcast can fit into this a little bit. And all those things are informative and can reach people. It's not what changes policy. You've got to get face-to-face with people who make decisions. Now, so I get my students out there. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean, however, that you should just walk into the door of your legislator or congressperson or parliament member, because there are so many ways to be more effective to engage. All of those folks have a trusted network of people that they confide in. And getting to that trusted network is just as effective and can be just as effective as getting in the door. Now, eventually, I want my students to get in front of a politician who's making the decisions. But prior to that, they meet with community members, they meet with community groups, they meet with people who are involved in the issue and start to impact change. Sometimes we sort of think about policy change as that big decision that gets made, yes or no, on an issue, but that's not actually how it happens. Policy is impacted and changes through many small interactions along the way, and building up and accumulating those interactions is eventually what changes policy.
So what you're saying is that there's many different ways that you can engage different levels. So not just high top end policymakers, but maybe someone in your local community, for example.
Somebody in your local community who knows a top end policymaker well. And look, the thing about it is, if you walk in the door, and I coming at this of my experience as somebody who's run for office, somebody who was a staff, who staffed a Senate Education Committee here in Arizona. If you're a stranger walking in the door, your threshold for being understood and for somebody having trust and confidence in you is pretty high, right? But if you can get somebody else to vouch for you, somebody who the politician trusts, well, now you have changed the dynamics. If somebody they trust says, I spoke with Eliza on this issue, or I saw their report, or I saw their study, and it's really good. You should take a look at it. That is tremendously empowering and impactful. And it, in my opinion, can help set the ground for getting face to face with the politician without just walking in the door. And that makes a big difference.
It sounds like in modern parlance, this really does sound like influence, which is a concept that I imagine many younger students particularly would well be able to understand.
It influences one thing, but you don't necessarily need the leverage, right? That's associated with influence. I would say it's more exposure. It is more getting out to people, exposing them to the issues that you're passionate about, the way you're thinking about it, the data that you're bringing to it, and using that exposure over and over again to eventually persuade. And that can come from many different places.
Absolutely. You are someone who has sought policy impact for a large portion of your career. We've talked a bit about policy, policy impact is and how to start making it. But I would like to also know why. So why would an academic seek to make policy impact?
It's great question. So, two very different types of people in academia find their way to my work and to my book. One is graduate students. And graduate students, yes, they're interested in research, and yes, they're interested in the acquisition of knowledge, but they want to do something. They care about communities, they care about the state of the world, and they want that to change, and they see research and academia as a way of getting there. And so I get a number of graduate students who get attracted to my work because not only do they want to write about it, they want to go do something about it. Now, on the very other end of the spectrum, I also work with senior academics who, looking back on their career, are asking the question, how has my work made a difference? I mean, I've got pages and pages of citations and references, but what's happened as a result of my work? And they find my work interesting, and they get gravitated to my work because now they want to go out and see that their research and their scholarship into fruition, into something that actually changes the circumstances for the schools, communities, schools, countries that they're invested in.
So you mentioned your book, Teach Truth to Power, How to Engage in Policy Education. But just generally speaking, how do researchers in education or beyond identify what parts of their work will resonate with policymakers and the public?
Well, it's interesting because I generally get the reverse. I get people who are passionate about studying something. They have done research in the area, they have written in the area, and now they want to go out and use that expertise to impact policy. So, generally speaking, people show up at my door with a problem already in hand, with research already in hand, trying to figure out how then to turn it into policy. Now, my recommendation to them is sort of twofold. Number one, you got to get out there more generally than just your topic. And you need to be available to help politicians answer questions that are not necessarily connected to the sliver of knowledge and research that you may have any interest in. And why I say that because in that process, you're building trust with them and you're getting them to understand and know who you are and what you can contribute. I do this quite a bit. I answer questions that are outside my field, and I help people make decisions in those areas. So I do that so that when the topic turns to my areas, well, then I can be sort of the first person on the list to join. The second thing I ask people to think about when they're looking at the sort of the public importance of their work and the policy importance of their work is, can you enlist an unexpected ally to bring your work forward? And what I mean by an unexpected ally is somebody other than yourself or your colleagues who was willing to take the time and the political capital to bring your idea to somebody else. It is a strict test of the sort of public importance of your topic. It helps you figure out, okay, how do I think about presenting this to somebody? How do I persuade them? And it is extraordinarily powerful in a policy context. People may not appreciate this. They haven't been around the legislature or around the Senate a lot, but it's like the movie Groundhog's Day. Do you know that idea of the movie Groundhog's Day? It's the same thing over and over and over again. The same groups bringing much the same problems every year. But when new people bring ideas, it changes the dynamics. And so go out and look for an unexpected ally to bring your work.
That is quite a different way, actually, from how I've thought from a very lay perspective of impact before. So you're really talking about establishing a profile and establishing networks around your expertise.
But networks that are not existing networks, because those existing networks are exactly what you'd expect. So just a couple examples. I had somebody who came to me and she was interested in housing and really subpar mortgages and wanted to have an impact on that. And I said, you have an education problem. Because if people are in bad mortgages and they have to move, it's very disruptive to students' educational progress. So we took this to a few education people, and not just the housing people took it to the legislature, housing and education people took it to the legislature. And it was a much more powerful coalition than if it was just a singular topic around mortgages. It became a question or a topic not just of bad mortgages, but the impact on families and on students when there are families in mortgages that are bad and they have to move. And coalitions are political power, and it turned out wonderful. And so my students and the people I work with, they look for what we call unexpected allies to join them. Again, not in the issue network. We're looking at people that are one degree removed, who have an interest in the topic and who are willing to join and help you get the word out.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you have, as you have said, worked in government for the Department of Education and have run for the governorship of Arizona in 2018, I believe. What has this involvement with government from the other side taught you about what academics need to know? So perhaps I'm looking for advice around tips for young players or common mistakes that you can see quite clearly when you're the policymaker, when you're on the side of government.
So academics have this habit. They have this habit when asked a question of taking you back through literally the entire history of that issue. And they start from the beginning and they bring you from the beginning all the way up to the moment that you're at now, to today. And as a politician, that is not particularly helpful. What is most helpful to you, what you want to know, is what's going to happen tomorrow. And when I work with people and they get concerned about this, prediction is the number one and most important contribution you can make. I'm going to give you a choice. Look, when I was running for governor, I knew education really well. I didn't know healthcare well. And when I talked to people, they came to me, and if I had two people in front of me, and one of them said, "Let me give you the history of Arizona's healthcare system from the beginning to today," you start to roll your eyes. But if somebody said, "Look, let me tell you where we're at and what's going to happen tomorrow," then you perk up. Now, sometimes academics are very, very concerned about making predictions and not making good predictions. But I tell them, one, if you're an expert in your field, who better than you to understand what's going to happen next with respect to a policy than somebody like yourself who has studied this issue really well, number one. And number two, you don't need to make grand predictions. You certainly don't want to get outside your data or your understanding, but you can make an enormous number of predictions for people to understand what's going to happen next. And so when I walk in the door with somebody, or when I get a call from the media, I don't take them through the history of a topic. I start with, well, let me understand it, and let me tell you what I think is going to happen next. And it's pretty magical when politicians or policymakers, when what you say is going to happen actually happens. Guess what? They call you back and they say, "Okay, what's going to happen now?" And so focusing on prediction is the number one thing that I think that academics don't do well enough when they get in front of people making decisions.
That's so interesting. As you were speaking, I was thinking about what policy impact actually looks like. So you've got your paper in the minister's hand, or you've had an opportunity to get in the room and explain your work. How do you then measure the impact? What sort of real world things are you looking for? And perhaps in terms of using it to secure further funding, another reason that the impact is important, how do you evidence this impact?
Yeah, so a few different ways. The most logical way is, did the body pass a piece of legislation that is influential and in the direction that you hoped? And that can be anywhere from, in the United States, from a school board, a city council, all the way up to the executive level. That's the easiest one. The harder ones is did something not happen? And that's a harder one to measure, trust me. But the times that a staffer or a politician calls and they have an idea and you don't hear about that idea anymore, I would count that as evidence that you had some influence. And it's a harder one because, sometimes things not happening is just as effective as something happening. But there are some other ways as well. Look, I believe that we should be giving politicians and people making decisions frameworks, ways of seeing the world, not sound bites. This is not necessarily necessary. The purpose of a framework is it's not coming out of my mouth. I am tailoring it so that it can eventually come out of your mouth. And if people start talking about issues in a way that you have framed them, that is an enormous victory. That is a really important victory to you. Another way to measure, do you get calls? Are you getting calls from people to help as they make decisions? And not are you seeking them out, but are they seeking you out?
We talk a lot in terms of impact about communication skills, finding the right language to communicate with policymakers and government bodies. Is there a hidden skill set that you really only learn once you start interacting with the kinds of people who can actually make a difference?
There is a hidden skill set. And it actually is what prompted the title of the book, Teach Truth to Power. There are a lot of people in a policy context who are going to speak truth to power, meaning they're going to give their opinion. But one of the things people may not appreciate is that politicians, people who are making policy decisions, often are novices. Now, that does not mean that they're not smart, and it doesn't mean that they're not educated. It means they do not have the same level of expertise in or experience in the content area in which you do. As an example, sometimes I work with people who are involved in special education, for example, but they may not appreciate that the people making decisions have never been in a special education classroom, have never had a student who was in special education. And so and these people are educated. I often get questions about markets in education. It's one of my areas. But if you look at the Constitution, at least in the United States, of education committees, they're often filled with business people. And would you expect business people to inject competition into their work? Yes, it's what they know. It's what they've been taught. It's what their academic and professional background is in. And so the secret here is to think of people making decisions as novices. And our job, and we're really good at this as academics, is teaching. And it's about teaching truth to power. Now, if you do that, you're not going to get political. You're also not going to get in a position where you get sideways with respect to getting too political. And so thinking about how do I get somebody who may not have the same level of expertise in my area to understand it well enough to make a decision. And if you think about it as novices, there's actually a good amount of research on how novices become experts. And I use that research in my work. And one of the ways, for example, novices make general decisions. So if you have something that is 2, 3, 4 sort of parts linked together, that's probably a lot for a novice. So how do you think about making that a singular decision, followed by another decision, followed by a third decision? How do you present frameworks, general frameworks for people to understand the world? And how do you break down complex systems into manageable pieces? We do this as academics. We create models and we take the complex world and put it into a simplified model. We just don't necessarily walk in the door and think about our job that way in terms of influencing policy. But it is the secrets. It's the secret to getting out and becoming invaluable in a policy context.
This also sounds like a commitment over time. So thinking about turning someone or cultivating expertise in a contact. So with policy impact, does this then require time planning and commitment? And also, what does it look like day to day? Is it setting aside an hour a day to make phone calls or communicating with the media? Like how do you sort of fit it into your day?
That is a really very, very good question. It is a commitment. And I think that early on, as I work in classes, I do this as I work with faculty across the country, they realize that publishing in a journal is not enough, and you've got to do something more. So what is it, what does it look like day to day? It is extra time, but it doesn't necessarily need to be completely detached to what you're doing. So let me tell you how I go about it. Often with my students and we are working on 2 documents at the same time, a document that we're going to submit for academic purposes and another one that we're going to put out for public consumption. And the difference between the two is the one for public consumption doesn't have detailed methods in it. It doesn't have a lengthy literature review in it. It's shorter. The writing is more concise, but it is not simplified. It's not in any way made easier. It's just it's accessible, because I think the folks who don't want to read that, they're not interested in the history of the topic or of the methods. Now, we put some of that into an appendix for people who are interested. And the third thing we do is we do make phone calls. We do start to connect with people. We send it out. We send it out to somebody in the local community and ask them to read it and then get an opportunity to meet with them. And that part, public engagement, is, at least for many of my students, really enjoyable, because they get a chance to get to a community meeting or a neighborhood meeting or an organizational meeting or meet with somebody and talk about the topic. But we certainly get out there and get face-to-face as well. So that's what it looks like day to day.
Following on from that, what is it that you find personally rewarding about policy impact?
I can't separate for myself studying policy and doing policy. It has been part of my constitution from the beginning. And to me, I get tremendous satisfaction about not just putting something out for my colleagues to read, but when that gets turned into people who can use it to make decisions, it's the most invigorating part. It can be one of the most invigorating parts of what I do. And a lot of students, when they get something passed, when they get their school board to make a decision, I kind of create these folks out there who want more and more of it. And so I can't separate the two. I think studying policy at some level has to involve doing it. Otherwise, in my opinion, we're kind of putting it out there into an echo chamber. And we're going to get to that point that I mentioned to you earlier, which is after we've done this enough, we look back and ask, okay, well, what's happened in the world as a result of that? And so it's all one and the same to me.
As a final question, I wanted to ask about the challenges and rewards, perhaps, of cutting through and reaching the people who can make a difference at a time when public discourse around higher education in the US, but not just in the US, is a bit difficult. Support for universities is mixed, shall we say. So how do you go about making a difference at a time when it is more important than ever that higher education's expertise is shared?
Yeah, so challenges and rewards. I just mentioned the reward. It is absolutely rewarding to have an impact. The challenge you already mentioned, which is it is extra time. There's also a challenge because people do not like getting in front of politicians and then getting crossways, and their deans get calls because they're out commingling with politicians, or they may have said something or done something. That is a challenge, although most places, I think, welcome a little of that, in the sense that at least their faculty are out, working in the environment. But there's certainly a challenge there of getting political, or at least being seen that way. This idea of the present challenges we're in, let me tell you how I'm thinking about this twofold. Number one, we're on the defense. And I think we've got to sit down and think through how to hold the line and how to defend what we are and what we contribute. But I would also spend time and energy, and I am here doing it myself, on what's going to happen next. Because this will turn in some direction, and we can have some control about how it turns, about how we emerge from here. Because if you're not thinking about the future, and again, this idea of prediction, then you're always in crisis mode and you're always defending. There are people who shape the public discussion in ways, and they do this because they're looking ahead. And I think we should be doing some of that. We should be thinking long and hard about, okay, as this turns, how now can we best communicate, best present ourselves, best make the argument about our contributions to society as higher education institutions. And that kind of visioning process is extraordinarily important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. That is a great note, I think, to end on. So thank you so much for your time today, David. It's been terrific talking to you.
You're welcome. And I hope as a result of this, folks listen and they decide themselves to get face to face with someone and start this process. I think they're going to be pleasantly surprised at how much of an impact they can make.
For David, it seems relationships and networking are the key to achieving effective policy impact. His message is very much that without building trust with the right people, you are unlikely to get very far. I was quite struck by his advice that academics should be willing to move outside of their specialism when speaking to policymakers and engage on broader topics, just to build exposure and trust. Now, I guess he's not suggesting that academics just tell policymakers any old thing and wade in on issues that they have simply no idea about. I guess this is about seeing where your expertise can be applied perhaps a bit more widely. I also really like David's just get out and do it attitude. And even on the point of the challenges posed by current Trump administration in relation to US higher education, he takes a refreshingly can-do attitude, pointing to the need for academics to very clearly make their case. There is also a lot of alignment with some of the points that Michael Sanders brought up around considering what the public importance of your research could be and what its relevance for those in government is, and to really think about that from the very start. Now, Michael is speaking from the UK context, and his focus is much more upon the modes and mechanisms by which researchers communicate with policymakers. Hi, Michael. Great to talk to you. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well. Great to have you on the podcast. I know late last year you stepped up as Director of King's College London's School of Government. I wondered if you could tell us what this role involved.
Sure. So the School for Government at King's is reasonably new. We've existed under a previous name of the International School for Government, but we've just rebranded to the School for Government. And we aim to combine teaching and research in a way that supports creating a world that is led with intelligence, integrity, and innovation. So that means we conduct research on how government works, or sometimes how it doesn't work quite so well, and how it might work better. And then we use that research either to inform civil service and the way that it works, or to form the basis of our education programs, which are mostly focused on training professionals, particularly professional civil services in the UK and overseas.
Yeah, so your work is very much focused upon having tangible outcomes, actually altering the way things are done based on the evidence.
Yes, absolutely. That's been the story of my career from the very beginning, and that's what we're aiming to do here as a school.
Yes, and just on the subject of your career, you've had quite an unusual career because you've moved between academia and government. So, having started your academic career, you then moved into the civil service, I believe, and stayed there for some time before returning to the academic fold. Can you give us a quick summary?
So I worked in the civil service from 2012 to 2014, at which point the team that I was in Cabinet Office, the Behavioural Insights Team, span out of government. So it was still owned by Cabinet Office, but we were not formally civil servants. And then in 2019, I became the chief executive of What Works for Children's Social Care, which is a government-funded charity that does research on how to improve outcomes, imaginatively enough, in children's social care. And then I came into King's as a professor full-time in 2022.
Okay, brilliant. So, I mean, you sort of moved between, yes, academia, government, civil service, got a breadth of experience across all of these areas. One thing I was intrigued by is I read that you actually started in the civil service on a 3-month placement, and you clearly then chose to stay for a lot longer than that. What made you decide to stick with working in government for so much longer?
As you say, I came in a 3-month placement, and I felt like where we were in Cabinet Office at the time, particularly in the Behavioural Insights team, it was a really exciting place to be, where I got to use the skills I had as a researcher to do work on really meaningful policy areas. So, for example, reducing antimicrobial resistance, but on increasing social mobility in the proportion of young people from disadvantaged backgrounds who go to university, and helping people to get into work faster. And that really brought together the best of both worlds for me. So using really rigorous evidence, but having it really joined up with what were the policy questions of the day, and really having a route to making that impact in a way that it is harder to do if you're in a university.
Yes, and on that point of making a difference and actually sort of implementing changes with the information, data, evidence that you're uncovering, what did your time working in government as a civil servant teach you about the relationship between academics and policymakers?
So at its best, this is a relationship that's hugely beneficial to both sides. It's very symbiotic, but it's often a difficult relationship because civil servants have a different set of priorities, often a different set of timescales to academics. And as well as civil servants not having really the training in the academic research methods, which is what you'd expect, there's also often a lack of understanding on the academic side about how to communicate with policymakers in a way that is really useful. And there's obviously a wide variety of different ways of approaching that, but the place that I always try to start in my research is who is the audience for this research in government and how will it be useful for them and what question will it allow them to answer that is of practical use to them. And whilst obviously I don't always get that right, I think if you start from that mindset of how can I be of service, then you're more likely to have success. It's also if you engage your interlocutors in the civil service early and often, then you have a pre-made audience ready for the findings of your research when you get to the other end. Whereas if you start interacting with them only once you've got your findings, then it's just a lot more difficult.
So once an academic has considered who in government their research findings are most relevant for and how it may be useful, what need it might serve, and really put that at the heart of their thinking in terms of their communications, what then are the mechanisms by which they can reach the relevant people? For instance, do departments or policy groups put out calls for evidence, or can it just be done by cold approaches? What are the best ways just simply to reach the right people?
Sure. So when the government is looking to make a new policy in a particular area, they will very often be running a consultation of some kind, and you can engage with that. And there'll be formal calls for evidence, but there'll also be more general forms for a consultation that you can seek to engage with. If you're lucky, like we are here at King's, to have something like the Policy Institute, which is a knowledge exchange institute, then you can speak to the people in that who will be in much more regular contact with civil servants and be able to find the right person for you to speak to directly. You also have organizations, so parliamentary select committees, things like the Office of the Children's Commissioner, who will conduct reviews or reports or investigations, and they'll often have a call for evidence associated with that. If you're working in loosely a social policy domain, so housing and homelessness, education, youth violence, crime, that kind of thing, then there's very often a What Works Centre. There's a network of 12 of them that were set up by the government, independent of government, but working very closely with them to help act as that sort of translation engine for research in its many and varied forms into something that's useful for the civil service and for policymakers. And so building a relationship with the What Work Centre that's most relevant for your work can be a really productive way of engaging with that, because the people at those What Work Centres are often very stable. They have stable relationships with government, and that means that when there's a change in civil service personnel or ministerial personnel, they are maintaining those relationships across different people in different posts in a way that, if I'm honest, is very difficult to do if you're in a university and you've got your nose to the grindstone of research and teaching most of the time.
Yes, and just to be clear, the What Works Centres, these are research organisations backed by the government to undertake research and thus underpin evidence-based decision making in government. You've mentioned there are 12 of them, so it's just worth highlighting these do exist for almost all social policy areas, and therefore, whatever area an academic may be working in, it is likely that there will be a What Works Centre that they could engage with. You mentioned earlier that you feel academics should be really thinking about, assuming that they want to get involved with policy engagement, should be thinking about this really early in the research process. Now, that makes complete sense on one level, but I do just wonder how, on a practical level, that can work if people are doing research when they don't really know at that stage where it will lead. And perhaps slightly playing devil's advocate, but is there potentially then a danger of them almost chasing particular results rather than just having a completely impartial approach to the research and it uncovering what it uncovers?
Sure. So I think it's important to make a distinction between sort of the basic science type of research, as you might think of it, and very applied research, right? So there is lots of excellent research that is quite theoretical, or which observes government, or which doesn't, its job isn't to try and change policy. My argument is mostly about if you are an applied researcher and you want to change policy, then thinking about it sooner rather than later is a good idea. To take the point of devil's advocate, so what you should always be seeking to do is to be useful. I don't think what you should be seeking to do is to be popular. I think those are important distinctions. So the way I think about it is governments issue areas of research interest, so they publish what they are interested in knowing from a research standpoint, and they commission research evaluation, and they have questions that they are interested in. And civil servants and ministers can, it is absolutely their role to set questions, and those questions might be, how can we improve grades in maths for young people on free school meals? Or how can we reduce the number of people who are rough sleeping in Greater Manchester? Those are perfectly reasonable questions to ask. What government doesn't get to do in this equation is choose the answers to those questions. So our job as academics is to impartially try and work out what the correct answer to the question, how do I reduce rough sleeping in Greater Manchester? And often we'll find ourselves answering more granular questions. So, for example, does the Housing First program, does that have the effect of reducing rough sleeping among a particular population? And so it's our job to answer that question. Now, knowing the answer to that question, even if the answer to that question is no, it doesn't work, is useful. However, answering the question, that thing you've just paid for, or that thing that you think is really nice doesn't work, does not make you popular. And so I think that's a really important distinction. They get to pick the questions, they don't get to pick the answers. And if you look at the research that I've commissioned, the research that I've conducted, I think that's a theme that runs through it, is we are always trying to answer questions that are useful to ministers, but very often they will not get the answer they were hoping for because quite a lot of things just don't happen to work.
Yeah, of course. And is there ever pushback on that? Have you ever witnessed academics feeling under pressure, or not being received gladly when they deliver the results that maybe the government doesn't want to hear?
Absolutely. So there is definitely pressure when you are working with somebody, particularly if you have not a personal relationship in the more common usage, but if you work with somebody for 4 years on a project, so a project I ran when I was involved with children's social care, which was evaluated by Dave Westlake at Cardiff University, we placed social workers into something like 130 schools around the country. It's a very expensive trial. It cost tens of millions of pounds in total, and the conclusion that came out of the evaluation from colleagues at Cardiff was that it didn't have the effect that we'd hoped that it had. Now, I know that, if I was running the evaluation for that project, then I would have felt some pressure to find that it worked, because I want it to work, and I value the colleagues that I work with around the country who deliver the intervention. So there is definitely a feeling of pressure there. But I think firstly, there's a reason we commission independent evaluators, but we have to overcome that pressure, because actually, if you really care about achieving the ends you want to achieve, i.e. reducing the number of children who are entering care in this case, then honesty is always the best policy. Now, does that mean that ministers are always happy to hear that you've said something? Absolutely not. And people on the ground are not happy to hear it either. But for most policies, ministers aren't, it's not a matter of like very high ideology. And so they are willing to hear that things don't work. And they might decide that they disagree. And by that, I mean, I've had conversations with directors of children's services where they've said, yes, I understand that social workers in schools doesn't reduce entry to care, but there are other reasons that I might want to do that. Another example of that might be breakfast clubs. So, large-scale trial by the Education Endowment Foundation concluded that breakfast clubs don't improve grades, right? So we don't improve children's grades by giving them breakfast at school. Now, ministers have turned around and said, thank you for letting us know. However, we think there is a compelling moral reason to want children not to be hungry. And so they are absolutely free to say, despite the fact that the research evidence says it doesn't improve this outcome, we still think it's the right thing to do. And that's what they're for, right? Ministers are supposed to make those kinds of moral judgments. That was what they were elected to do. My job is simply to arm them with the best possible evidence when they're making those decisions.
Yes, of course. And that sort of dispassionate approach, while it may be difficult, as you say, is part of the kind of professional characteristic that academics need. Also, taking the social workers in schools as an example, it may have had a lot spent on that trial, but a lot more would have been spent had it been rolled out more widely based on faulty evidence. So I guess there is always a very strong argument for the truth in these things.
And if you always conclude that everything you look at works, then you're not very credible, right? The reason why people can believe me when I say this thing does work is because sometimes things don't work and I tell them that.
Yes, absolutely. My initial thought was that it would be a potential problem that academics often are very, very narrow in their focus of a study for very good reasons, because to do a study well, it generally needs a pretty specific focus. And that potentially that would be problematic sometimes with policy when actually there are so many broader impacts, knock-on effects, complexities of the reality in which these things are working. But from what you say there, describing that process of providing the evidence and ministers being able to use that among many other factors, it could almost be a benefit. I mean, where do you stand on this?
So I think we have to view ourselves as working in, we're working in a giant policy pin factory, to go with the Adam Smith example, where different people working within the factory have different roles. Putting differently, we all work in a giant kitchen, and my job is to be very, very good at preparing vegetables. And I do that day in and day out, and I'm very, very focused on that. A different person is very, very focused on, cooking chicken. And then, that's a different role entirely. Some people are very, very focused on taking plates out to people, taking orders, making sure people have a good experience in the day-to-day reality of sitting in a restaurant. And then you have a head chef, which is probably the minister in our example, who oversees everything and sees how everything fits together. The fact that one person is specialized in one thing and one person is specialized in another doesn't denigrate or detract from the other. We are all part of a greater whole. And I think as long as we all recognize that what everybody's doing is important and probably in some ways equally important, then I think it's fine for us all to have different roles. I think it's when we start judging one person by the criteria of another, or we start getting into a hierarchical or an overly hierarchical relationship between different skill sets, it can become problematic. But in general, I think it's fine for some people to be very highly specialized.
Yes, and as the example of, say, social workers in schools and collecting evidence on that, but a minister being able to look at it and say, well, there are other reasons for doing it. Person collecting the evidence, it's no bad thing if they have a narrow focus, because otherwise it could just muddy the results of what they're looking at if they're trying to factor in too many other elements.
Yes, absolutely. So a particular research project which has a particular goal gives you a clarity of focus which enables you to answer that question very clearly.
Yeah.
When I see people who I have 25 research questions to answer, to not quite quote Voltaire, right? If you to investigate everything is to investigate nothing. And so doing few things very well with that clarity of purpose enables us to be useful.
Yes, yeah. What then prevents greater collaboration between government and academia?
So, as with many things, money is a factor. So, researchers who are like proper faculty members have the opportunity to work on pursue the research that they're most interested in. But running some of these studies requires funding, and that is quite scarce. And government is understandably reluctant to spend money on research that they could be spending on delivering policies, right? So if it's going to cost £250,000 to run a particular research study, that's approximately the sticker price on 5 teachers. And I need to convince government that at that moment in time, spending the money on my research project is a better use of that money than paying for 5 additional teachers. And that is an appropriately high bar to try and clear. There are also cultural differences where the civil service very often wants answers right now, and academics say, well, you can't have them right now, but if you give me some time, we will get to that. I think academics are not solely incentivized by having an impact and interacting with policymakers, and nor should they be. So we have our teaching to be concerned about, but we also have publication and making a contribution to the intellectual development of our field. And so that creates different incentives which change the way that you interact with one another. I think on a cultural level, the thing that makes when I was a civil servant and I tried to collaborate with academics as an academic, when I've been trying to collaborate with civil servants, the biggest barrier is when people just don't want to understand the other side of the equation and think that the other side is, not as intelligent, not as hardworking, not as thoughtful as the other. And you see some element of victim blaming on that, where you have academics saying, the problem is, we really want to engage with civil servants, but they just don't have the intellectual tools to interact with us as researchers. And, if someone said that to me when I was a civil servant, then I wouldn't want to collaborate with them either. And that's not universal at all, but where I do see that, it does make me quite sad.
Yeah, I bet. I imagine you've alluded to the way in which academics should go about trying to communicate why their research is useful to civil servants. I mean, I can see, is there potentially a bit of a communication issue? I'm basing this purely on the way that academic papers tend to be written, where there's a huge amount of detail and context and sort of scenario setting, explanations of how the research was carried out. And of course, the kind of key findings tend to come right at the end. I can see for a busy civil servant with a lot of papers to sift through and an awful lot of information to assimilate, that might not be the most effective mechanism by which to present information to them. Is that difference in the academic way of communicating and the more government or mainstream way of communicating, is that a challenge, or do you think that's largely been overcome with the help of things like policy institutes to guide these things?
I think the existence of things like policy institutes do make a difference. I think there are still people who say, well, I published my paper, and and people will say, oh, that's not me. But I have heard people say, I've published a paper and I'm confident that it will have an impact. It's like, well, that's not going to happen unless you actually put your shoulder into it. I think you have to recognize an academic paper, the audience for that is not a civil servant. And so we need to make sure that, as well as our academic papers, which are obviously essential for peer review and making sure that what we're doing is right, we also publish other forms of things, and there's a wide variety of accessible formats that we could choose to do that. We also need to, so there's this idea in negotiation theory of listening from the inside, which is where you try and listen to yourself or view the world from the perspective of the person who you're negotiating with. And things that are important for a civil servant are often different to the things that are important to an academic. So I am a randomized controlled trial person. I love methods. I love econometrics. I love statistics. But that's not the important part of a paper. And if you've got 20 minutes to present to a civil servant and you spend the first 10 minutes talking about econometrics, then you should expect their eyes to have glazed over by the time you get to your actual substance. So there is a question of, as I say, listening from the inside, learning to communicate that which is actually important to the civil servant, rather than whatever you think is the most important or most interesting bit of the paper. So that's certainly a factor. And sometimes I think it's worth saying, if you have a piece of research that you cannot work out how it should be interesting or how it should be communicated to policymakers, that's fine, right? As you said, like, not all pieces of research need to be focused on improving policy outcomes. But if you do have something that you think should be influential or should be impactful, then thinking about what part of it is going to be the most interesting and how you communicate that, I think that is very important, and we are not nailing that just yet.
Yeah, that's really, really good advice. Do you think the growing focus on, open quotes, impact, close quotes, as part of the academic rewards rating system, is this making a notable difference in this area?
So I think it is making a difference. I think we talk about impact a lot more. We think about impact a lot more. I think we could do it a lot better still. And I think partly it's what's the way of thinking about it. So I have a 7-year-old son, and I could promise him all of the chocolate in the entire world in exchange for him writing down his cubic times tables up to 20. The problem with that is he might very much want to achieve that task that I've set him, but he doesn't have the skills to do it. He doesn't know how to do it because he's only 7. And whilst I don't want to compare my academic colleagues to a 7-year-old, incentivizing academics to have impact doesn't mean they have impact unless they have the tools and the knowledge they need in order to have those impacts. And things are a lot better than they were when I was in Cabinet Office, and you saw people sort of saying, well, I've had an impact because I had a meeting with Michael Sanders and he's a civil servant. And I'm like, well, that's not an impact because that meeting didn't go very well. So things are improving, but we are still asking people to do something that is not their natural skill set, and where they often don't have the right level of support in order to do that. We are very lucky at King's. We do have a lot of support to do that. And as I say, the Policy Institute is fantastic at that. But not everybody has access to that kind of resources. And that makes a real difference to how much impact you can really have versus how much impact you can say you've had because you submitted evidence to a select committee.
So it's an ongoing learning process, really.
It is, but so is everything in research and academia and public policy. So that shouldn't be a surprise.
Yeah, very true. Well, look, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this. So many useful takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So there is still work to do in terms of equipping academics with the skills to help them succeed at policy work. But many institutions in the UK do have policy institutes or equivalents to help with this. There is a lot of useful intel there in those conversations for academics interested in policy work, so go forth and make it happen. For more practical pointers and insights on how best to engage policymakers, communicate your findings, understand the workings of government and build networks, check out our latest Spotlight guide. It brings together advice on all this from academics all over the world. And you can find that at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.